A racist officer assaults a black teen with a spit hood, unaware the boy's father is the new police chief. Jamal Carter had always been taught by his father to stay composed in the face of authority, no matter the situation. His father had drilled it into him from an early age, knowing the weight of history and the dangers that lurked in every interaction with law enforcement. He had heard the stories, seen the news, and knew that as a black teenager in America, he had to move carefully, to always be aware of how he was perceived, how his every movement could be scrutinized, twisted, and used against him. But nothing could have prepared him for the night that would change everything. It was a cold evening in downtown Atlanta, the air crisp with the first hints of winter settling in. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the city slowing down as businesses began to close and only a few cars passed by on the road. Jamal, just 17, had stopped by a gas station to grab a drink before heading home, something he had done dozens of times before. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as he walked out of the store, bottle in hand, his breath visible in the chilled air. His mind was on nothing more than getting home, finishing up some homework, maybe watching a game with his dad if he was still awake. The thought was comforting, grounding in its normalcy, but normalcy was about to be shattered. As he stepped off the curb, the sudden flash of blue and red lights filled his peripheral vision, washing over the pavement in ominous pulses. A police cruiser pulled up beside him, the engine humming, a predatory presence in the stillness of the night. The door swung open with force, and the officer inside, a heavy-set white man with a shaved head and sharp blue eyes, stepped out, his gaze locking onto Jamal with an intensity that sent a shiver through him. There was something in the way the officer moved, the way he carried himself, exuding an authority that was not just official, but personal, as if he relished the control he held over the situation. The officer barked at him to get over there, his voice sharp, devoid of any attempt at civility or reason. Jamal hesitated, his pulse quickening, every muscle in his body tensing with the instinct to flee, even though he knew that running would only make things worse. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he understood that innocence did not matter here. His hands instinctively rose slightly, palms facing forward, a universal sign of surrender, just as his father had taught him. He knew better than to make any sudden movements, to argue, to do anything that could be perceived as aggression. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice even, careful. He said he was just heading home, that he hadn't done anything, but the officer wasn't listening. Within seconds, the officer closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, his thick fingers wrapping around Jamal's arm in a bruising grip. There was no explanation beyond a sneering accusation that he matched the description of a robbery suspect. Jamal barely had time to react before he was yanked forward, his feet stumbling as he was slammed against the hood of the cruiser with enough force to knock the wind out of him. His face pressed against the cold metal, his breath fogging up the surface as he gasped, struggling to process what was happening. The weight of the officer pressed against him, pinning him in place, as if he were some kind of animal that needed to be subdued. Before he could even get a word in, another officer emerged from the passenger side, this one leaner but just as menacing, a wiry man with a cruel smirk that barely concealed his eagerness. He moved quickly, yanking Jamal's backpack off his shoulders and tossing it to the ground with casual disdain. He ordered Jamal to spread his legs, his voice edged with amusement, as if this were all some kind of game to him. Jamal tried to comply, but before he could even shift his stance, a hard knee struck him in the back, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his spine and forcing him onto the cold pavement below. His knees scraped against the rough asphalt, the sting barely registering through the growing fog of panic clouding his mind. He tried to say he didn't do anything, that they had the wrong person, but his voice cracked with fear, barely audible over the ringing in his ears. His words were met with immediate hostility. The first officer snapped at him to shut the hell up, his forearm pressing against the back of Jamal's neck, forcing his face closer to the ground. The asphalt was rough against his skin, small pebbles digging into his cheek, his breaths coming shorter and faster. Every movement felt futile, every plea drowned out by the sheer force of their aggression. He was trapped. And then the spit hood came out. Jamal couldn't see it at first, but he heard the rustle of fabric, the unmistakable sound of something being prepared. A thick, suffocating mesh bag designed to prevent detainees from spitting or biting. At least, that was what they claimed. But to Jamal, it felt like a death sentence. He had seen it before, seen what it did to people, how it turned human beings into faceless, voiceless objects, stripped of identity and dignity. His entire body went rigid as the rough fabric was yanked down over his head, the coarse material scratching against his skin, cutting off his peripheral vision, muffling the world around him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, the air inside the hood hot and stale, thick with his own exhalations. He tried to shake his head, to plead with them, but the words came out distorted, lost beneath the suffocating material. He struggled, his body instinctively recoiling against the overwhelming claustrophobia, but the officers took it as resistance. One of them muttered something under his breath, a low chuckle that sent a chill through Jamal's spine. He felt another hand on him, fingers digging into his arm as they twisted it back further, pushing the cuffs tighter against his wrists until he thought they might cut through his skin. The pain was secondary now, overshadowed by the sheer panic clawing at his throat. He gasped, trying to force in more air, his chest tightening with every breath. He pleaded again, barely able to get the words out, saying that he couldn't breathe, that he needed them to take it off, but his cries were ignored. The spit hood clung to his face, damp with sweat and the heat of his own breath, every inhale more desperate than the last. The world around him faded, reduced to nothing but the suffocating darkness inside the hood, the unrelenting pressure of hands on his body, and the distant, indifferent hum of the city that carried on as if nothing was happening at all. Jamal struggled, his hands still pinned behind his back, his body trembling under the weight of two grown men. The first officer, whom the badge identified as Officer Daniels, chuckled under his breath, his tone dripping with amusement as he remarked how these punks always wanted to play the victim. His voice was low, almost conversational, as if this was just another routine night, another routine beating, nothing out of the ordinary. His grip tightened as he shifted his weight, pressing Jamal further into the ground. His partner, Officer Green, stepped forward, his boots scraping against the pavement as he approached. His eyes gleamed with a cruel light, relishing the moment. Without warning, he lifted his baton and brought it down hard against Jamal's ribs. A sickening thud echoed in the air, followed by the sharp gasp that escaped Jamal's lips. His body curled slightly, his muscles convulsing in reaction to the pain that exploded through his side. He tried to inhale, but the sharp stabbing sensation in his chest made it difficult. His body screamed in agony, but no one listening cared. Another blow landed, this time against his thigh. The force sent another ripple of pain through him, his leg twitching involuntarily as if trying to flee on its own. The pavement beneath him was rough, the uneven surface pressing into his skin as he writhed under the officer's weight. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his mind racing between fight and surrender. The spit hood clung to his face, suffocating him with the smell of his own sweat and the damp heat of his ragged breathing. Panic began to claw at his throat, a tight, constricting feeling that only worsened with every second the hood remained over his face. He tried to calm himself, but his body was betraying him, the primal need for air overriding everything else. Daniels reached down and yanked him up by the collar, forcing him to his feet with a brutal jerk. His body dangled for a moment, his legs struggling to find balance as dizziness threatened to take over. Daniels turned slightly, angling his head toward Green as a smirk spread across his face. He mocked Jamal, repeating his words in a high-pitched, exaggerated tone, ridiculing his protests. The words cut deeper than the blows, not just meant to humiliate but to dehumanize, to reduce him to nothing more than an object of their abuse. His grip on Jamal's collar tightened as he shook him roughly, his breath hot against the mesh of the spit hood. Green let out a low laugh, stepping forward again. His posture was relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He suggested that Jamal needed a lesson in respect, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. The words were a prelude, a warning of what was coming next. Before Jamal could react, he was shoved forward with brutal force, his body crashing onto the asphalt. His cheek scraped against the rough pavement, a sharp sting shooting through his face as the first warm trickle of blood began to escape from a fresh cut on his temple. His mind reeled from the impact, a dazed fog momentarily clouding his senses. Around them, a few people had started gathering, their presence growing more noticeable as hushed murmurs mixed with the distant hum of traffic. Some held up their phones, the small glowing screens capturing everything. But Daniels and Green didn't care. They had done this before. They knew the routine, knew how to twist the narrative. The claim of resisting arrest would be enough. The accusation that the suspect was combative would justify the force. The system would handle the rest. They were confident in their power, in the shield that their badges provided, in the silence that so often followed incidents like these. And Jamal, he was just another black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. The realization settled over him, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on his already battered body. He had seen the headlines, the names that turned into hashtags, the faces that became statistics. He had never imagined that one day it could be him. Daniels leaned down, his voice lowering to a whisper that barely reached past the suffocating material of the hood. His tone was slow, deliberate, each word cutting like a blade. He told Jamal that nobody was coming to save him, that he was alone, that this was how the world worked. The words slithered into his ears, wrapping around his mind like a vice, squeezing the last bit of hope from his chest. But he was wrong. By the time Jamal was shoved into the back of the squad car, his wrists aching from the too tight cuffs digging into his skin, another police vehicle screeched into the lot, its tires skidding slightly against the asphalt. The sudden arrival cut through the tense night air, drawing the attention of the few bystanders still lingering at a distance. The officers barely looked up, assuming it was just another unit responding to the scene, another patrol car coming to reinforce their authority and clean up whatever fabricated mess they had already begun to weave. But this was no ordinary unit. The car door swung open with force, the sound slicing through the thick atmosphere. A heavy silence followed as the figure stepped out, his posture rigid, his presence commanding. Chief Carter stood motionless for a brief second, his eyes scanning the scene, absorbing every detail in an instant. The shattered glass glinting on the pavement, the streak of blood staining the ground, the gasps of onlookers who had remained frozen in a state of uneasy disbelief. Then his gaze landed on the battered figure in the back seat, his son, his only child. Daniels and Green stiffened the moment they recognized him. The easy arrogance that had been plastered across their faces drained away in an instant. Their muscles tensed, their hands instinctively shifting toward their belts, but no amount of preparation could have braced them for what was coming. Daniels straightened his back, his voice attempting to mask his sudden unease as he addressed the man before him. He greeted him with forced professionalism, stating that they had just apprehended a robbery suspect. His words were careful, measured, but they faltered under the weight of the moment, under the intensity of the gaze now drilling into him. Chief Carter's expression darkened, his features tightening as the scene unraveled before him. His breathing slowed, controlled, his chest rising and falling with a force that barely contained the storm brewing within him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as his eyes moved between the officers and his son. The bruises forming on Jamal's skin, the way his body trembled with exhaustion and fear, the blood crusting at the edge of his temple, a spit hood covering his face. The sheer brutality of it sent a cold fury surging through his veins. His voice was ice when it finally cut through the tension, commanding them to get his son out of that car. There was no room for argument, no room for delay. Daniels hesitated. His lips parted slightly, an instinctive attempt to protest, to offer some excuse, some justification, but the words never left his throat. Chief Carter's tone sharpened, the force of his words slamming into them like a physical blow. His command came again, this time louder, stronger, reverberating through the lot with a weight that left no room for defiance. His voice carried the authority of years spent in law enforcement, but beneath that authority was something even more dangerous, pure, unfiltered rage. Green moved first, his movements clumsy, rushed. His fingers fumbled as he reached for the door handle, yanking it open with an urgency that betrayed his fear. He dragged Jamal out roughly, the teenager stumbling forward as his legs threatened to give out beneath him. But before he could fall, before he could collapse into the cruel grip of the officers who had already taken so much from him, Chief Carter was there. With one swift motion, he reached forward and tore the hood off, his hands cradling his son's face, his thumbs brushing against the raw skin beneath his eyes. The sight of him like this, broken and breathless, nearly shattered him, but he forced himself to stay steady. His voice, though firm, carried the tremor of a father barely holding on to the last threads of restraint. He asked Jamal if he could breathe, his words edged with urgency, his fingers tightening ever so slightly around his son's jaw as if to reassure himself that he was still there, still alive. Jamal coughed, his body shuddering violently as fresh air filled his lungs. The hoarse rasp of his breath was the only response he could muster, but it was enough. He forced his eyes open, blinking against the harsh glow of the streetlights, his vision swimming as his father's face came into focus. There was something raw in his gaze, something fragile but unbreakable. His lips parted, and his voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion as he managed a single word. Dad. Chief Carter turned slowly, his movements deliberate, his spine rigid with barely restrained fury. His eyes locked onto Daniels and Green, the fury radiating from him in waves. The moment stretched, thick with an almost suffocating tension. He demanded an explanation, his voice lowering but no less lethal. He gave them 3 seconds to explain themselves, 3 seconds to give him a reason not to rip them apart where they stood. Daniels swallowed hard, the air between them turning electric with silent panic. His mouth opened, grasping for the well-rehearsed lies he had used so many times before, the fabricated claims of resistance, the carefully crafted words that twisted the narrative in his favor. But before he could utter a single syllable, before he could weave the same tale of self-justified brutality, the world snapped back into motion. A fist collided with his jaw, the impact sending him staggering backward. The sharp crunch of bone meeting bone filled the air, his head snapping to the side as pain exploded through his skull. He barely had time to register the shock before Chief Carter turned on Green, his hands finding purchase in the fabric of his uniform, shoving him violently against the side of the squad car. The metal groaned under the force, the officer's body slamming against it with a force that stole his breath. There was no hesitation in Chief Carter's movements, no second-guessing. The sight of his son, bruised and bleeding at the hands of men who were supposed to protect and serve, had stripped him of every ounce of restraint he had ever taught himself to uphold. His voice, now raw with fury, erupted as he demanded answers, his grip on Green's collar tightening with every syllable. The accusation hung in the air, laced with venom. He demanded to know if they had put a spit hood on his son, if they had beaten him with the same indifference they would show a lifeless object. Green stammered, his usual cocky demeanor crumbling under the weight of the moment. His hands shook as he grasped at the words that might save him, but they failed him. He tried to insist that they didn't know, his voice weak, brittle. Chief Carter's fury only deepened. The words twisted in his gut, igniting something dark and all-consuming. He roared the question back at them, demanding to know if they didn't realize Jamal was his son, or if they simply didn't care because to them, he was just another black boy they could brutalize without consequence. Neither answer would save them now. The department had no choice. Within hours, Daniels and Green were suspended pending an internal review, but it was clear from the beginning that the decision had already been made. The footage had spread too quickly, the outrage too immediate. By morning, the official statement was released, a hollow collection of words meant to pacify an already enraged public. But for Carter, the simple act of their termination was not enough. He wanted them charged. He wanted them in cuffs, facing the same cold dread that had filled his son's lungs when that spit hood was forced over his face. He wanted them to know the fear of being powerless, of being entirely at the mercy of those who saw them as nothing more than an inconvenience to be subdued. He wanted the weight of justice to press down on them with the same unrelenting force they had inflicted upon Jamal. Jamal, though shaken, stood strong beside his father as the department launched its full internal investigation. The bruises on his skin were fading, but the ones buried deep in his mind remained, surfacing in restless nights and sudden suffocating waves of panic. The sound of sirens made his stomach clench. The sight of flashing lights sent his pulse racing. But he refused to let the fear control him. He had seen what silence did, how it allowed things like this to keep happening, and he would not be silent. The footage from bystanders had taken on a life of its own, circulating through every corner of social media. It played over news broadcasts, dissected frame by frame, analyzed by commentators, condemned by activists. The cries of the crowd, the rough treatment, the hood being forced over his head, all of it laid bare before an audience that stretched beyond their city. Soon the nation was watching. People demanded accountability, called for action, flooded the precinct with calls and emails, demanding to know what would be done. The pressure mounted. The trial was swift. The evidence was undeniable, and no amount of rehearsed justifications or rewritten reports could erase what had been caught on camera. Daniels and Green were convicted of excessive force and misconduct. The spit hood, once used liberally without oversight, was now banned from the precinct, its cruel efficiency no longer a tool for unchecked abuse. It was a small victory, a single reform in a system that needed far more than a ban to cleanse its corruption. But it was something. Jamal walked out of the courtroom with his father beside him, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. He kept his head high, his shoulders back. The world now knew what had been done to him, and though it would never undo the damage, at least it had not been ignored. But the scars remained. The feeling of suffocation, of helplessness, haunted him long after the trial ended. Some nights, he woke up gasping, his mind tricking him into believing the hood was still there, that the hands were still pressing him down. The panic sat heavy in his chest, an unwelcome companion that refused to leave, but he refused to let it break him. And for Chief Carter? He had always known the system was broken. He had seen it from within, had watched men like Daniels and Green walk the halls with impunity, knowing they were protected by the badge, by the silence of their peers, by the very institution that claimed to serve justice. But now, it was personal. Now, it was his son. And that changed everything. He would not let it be forgotten. He would not let the precinct sweep it away with carefully crafted statements and quietly reassigned duties. He would make sure that every officer understood that this would not happen again, not under his watch. He was not just a police chief anymore. He was a father who had nearly lost his son to the very system he had sworn to uphold. And he was going to make damn sure it never happened again.